Should you shiver yourself thin?
So what the body naturally wants to do is tense up. And all the training is saying, no, relax, this is what you do with the ice. But I'm feeling it.
Last year, Stanford neuroscientist Andrew Huberman put out a video that changed the entire conversation around the purpose of cold exposure, when he said that the best way to burn fat was to shiver when you are in cold water. He knew this was a big deal because it went against the advice that all of us professional bathers had been giving for decades.
And most of the people that are using cold and frankly suggesting cold as a means to increase metabolism fat loss are suggesting the exact wrong protocol. In fact, the one I'm going to recommend is 180 degrees in the opposite direction to the typical protocol that you'd hear about.
If you've been following my work, you probably know that I do quite a bit of ice bathing. I've climbed up to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro without a shirt, done cold weather racers in almost no clothing, and built up a lot of resilience to the cold by teaching myself to relax when my body wanted to warm itself up by shivering. I've written 2 books on the topic, but now Huberman, who is rather famous and influential, is saying that I have been doing ice bathing wrong this whole time, at least when it comes to fat loss. And to be fair, he did say repeatedly that people can also use the cold for various other reasons, including mental resilience to combat autoimmune illnesses and other things that I've written about and talked about in various books and videos. However, when it comes to just burning fat, Huberman says that we've gotten it all wrong. There's a better way to ice bath, and he calls it his optimal fat loss protocol. Now, I have known Andrew for years. I spent time hiking with him in the mountains of California and had many, many wonderful, wide-ranging discussions with him about human biology and resilience. He plays a prominent role in my book, The Wedge, and I am extremely hesitant to contradict anything he says because I respect his opinion so much. However, it's been more than a year since his video and podcast on brown fat came out, and I think there are some major problems with his advice that need a second look. Later in this video, I'm actually going to try out his technique to see how my body responds, as well as why I think that, and I'm sorry to say this, Andrew, no one should ever actually do the program that he recommends. Huberman says that if you want to burn fat, you need to use the cold to trigger the shiver response as much as possible. Shivering, he argues, triggers muscle contractions, along with a neural epinephrine response that releases the acid succinate, which then sends a strong biological signal to your body to build more brown fat. There's a link to that part of his video right above my head, so you can hear it all in his own words if you want a more thorough description. He bases his protocols on a 2018 study in Nature that links the acid succinate to BAT generation, as well as research that shows how fidgeting, that just sort of like fidgeting, burns a tremendous number of calories. It is complex stuff. But, as he says, luckily,
the data on this are tremendous. I'll link to a few studies.
Actually, he only linked to one, and it wasn't particularly relevant. So I spent a few hours trying to dig up the sources that he mentioned based on the scant clues he dropped while talking, and I will paste them down below. But I'll also take him at his word that he is drawing on a massive pool of inherent knowledge, since, you know, he is a neuroscientist from Stanford. Based on his reading of the research, Huberman believes that the best way to get slim is to shiver as much as possible. Instead of relaxing once you get into the ice, you give into the sensation and tense up and shiver, and then let those small muscle movements continue as long as possible. He says you should make the ice immersions just 1 or 2 minutes long and do at least 2 sessions in a set, with just a small time hanging outside the bath to let that cold sink in a little bit deeper. Frankly, it sounds absolutely miserable, but he insisted that is the best way to do it.
if you get into cold water or an ice bath or a cold day, and you try and remain calm and resist shivering, you actually short circuit this mechanism for increasing brown fat thermogenesis. The paper published in Nature shows that it is shivering itself that causes the brown fat to increase your burning, your burn rate, and your metabolism.
Well, if I'm wrong about everything BAT, I had to give his method a whirl. He posted the protocol on the website for an ice bath company that he partners with called The Cool Plunge, and I wanted to be sure I was going to do it right. So I gave them my email address, which gave me access to a link where I could download a copy of his protocol myself. Now, before I go any further, I think I need to remind you that Huberman's video has been viewed more than 1.4 million times on YouTube, offering what is supposed to be a super quick way to burn fat. His podcast is even more popular than his YouTube channel, I think, and I have to assume it has millions of more listens. Given the attention that it has gotten, I naturally figured that both YouTube and the internet in general would be chock full of testimonials of people trying out his method with lots of anecdotal evidence that it changed their lives. There would be some pictures of someone who's fat and then slim afterwards. It would be everywhere. After all, what is more clickbaity than instant weight loss? And here's where things get really interesting and weird. Despite Huberman's scientific logic, I couldn't find a single video of someone actually doing his protocol on a regular basis. In fact, I had a hard time finding a single ice shiverer at all, except for this one, where a pretty fit-looking older gentleman is sitting in water and not actually shivering enough at all. Of course, that didn't mean that there weren't a lot of explainer videos talking about how important shivering was and how it was the secret to weight loss. It was just that no one seemed to be actually doing it. As far as I can tell from Instagram, which is not necessarily a great litmus test, not even Andrew Huberman gets in on the game. Instead, when it comes to ice baths, there are endless videos of people hanging out in cold water for really, really long periods of time, following the same basic methods that I have recommended for a decade. Indeed, it's the method taught by Wim Hof and Laird Hamilton and Brian McKenzie and just about every other ice guy out there, and ice girls. Here is Joe Rogan hanging out in an ice bath for 20 minutes, distinctly not shivering, despite having spent 3 hours talking to Huberman not so long before that about why he should be shivering. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. Check out all of these awesome and extremely calm ice bathers. Nevertheless, I think it's very important to demonstrate how to do the Huberman protocol as it is actually written. Because I've built up a lot of resilience to the cold, I am going to have to override my own training so that it short circuits my sympathetic, which is my fight or flight response, and actively accentuate shivering. So, with much trepidation, here goes.
Camera's ready. All right, getting in. Don't relax. It's hard to will myself to shiver. That refresh period may be important to starting with shivering really hitting. Okay, I'm gonna get out. We're gonna do the refresh. But just thinking about an ice bath not being comfortable was not that hard when you're in an ice bath thinking this will not be comfortable. All right, that was a 1 minute refresh. I'm gonna do one more. That's better. I'm getting the right reactions in my arms where I'm having good vasoconstriction, which means the vessels here have constricted and they feel numb, which usually doesn't happen this quickly to me. Oh yeah, the refreshes. If you want to shiver, the refresh is vital for that. Really good.
Your nipples are white.
These nipples are white. This nipple's for you, Andrew Huberman. I'd like to say for the record that I do not enjoy this experiment. This experiment is incredibly unenjoyable. Do I look slimmer though? I mean, do you see a change?
I do. You've lost a ton of weight since before this started.
I think we've accomplished the experiment. Let's see how I feel when I get out of here. All right, so that was 3 shiver protocols, and it worked. I'm shivering. And letting go into that experience and letting the cold go in is actually sort of an interesting thing. I don't usually work that way when I try this, but as far as activating the shiver response, I mean, cold water does it. It's the natural way. And I definitely have less resilience in that water than I normally do. Like you can hear my voice, the timbre is a little up and down. My ability to control myself is lower, which means the shivering is happening, the cold is getting in, and maybe I have activated that brown fat and built the brown fat because all those micro movements in my muscles are doing their thing. But I didn't enjoy it.
It turned out that it was especially hard for me to be able to trigger my shiver response, most likely because I have trained my body so well on how to resist the urge and stay warm without it. However, I did have a few moments where I could feel the cold deep in my body, and there were some really strong convulsions up my spine. It absolutely was not pleasant. I also don't see why shivering in the ice, to be honest, is important at all. When I use the ordinary protocols, it's pretty normal to have micro shivers for minutes or even hours afterwards as the body warms up, switching automatically between shivering and then non-shivering thermogenesis, as the shivers occasionally kickstart that process. It can happen literally for like hours on end. And if Huberman is saying that it is the small twitches that happen and those muscles that trigger the BAT production, that should be happening anyways. So what gives, right? Like, what is going on here? Well, my guess is that Huberman might be right, okay? He might have a protocol that works in theory and on paper, but most people who take regular ice baths will inevitably build up tolerance and end up learning to relax no matter what they do. I don't see any incentive at all to try to accentuate an uncomfortable and psychologically counterproductive shivering process. Huberman's protocols seem almost backwards to me. How can you build up the ability to heat up your body without shivering by, well, shivering? That's what BAT does. It does non-shivering thermogenesis. So what he's saying is that by shivering a lot, you learn not to shiver, and then shivering is sort of bad. It's like having your cake and eating it too. Cold exposure inevitably leads to building up BAT, and at some point you are going to build up tolerance. It could be that he's right that in the beginning, the very beginning, shivering is an efficient way to burn fat because the pathway he identified triggers building up BAT faster than sort of like a normal route. But even he admits that just sitting in cold water is still plenty good at ramping up metabolism overall. And there is no evidence at all, as far as I can tell, that someone who shivers all the time in an ice bath ultimately builds up more BAT reserves than someone who adapts themselves to the cold in sort of the more ordinary and comfortable way. And honestly, and this is the big thing, there's even a more glaring problem than just being rather miserable when you're in that ice bath and you're just shivering. There is amazing research that shows how relaxing in an ice bath produces anti-anxiety, anti-inflammatory, autoimmune, and even anti-cancer benefits precisely because you resist your natural inclination to switch into fight or flight while you are in an environment that wants to put you there. If you don't do that, if you don't make that switch and instead follow your natural inclinations of your body when you're under threat, you end up locking in counterproductive emotional signals into your nervous system. You accentuate the sensations of anxiety and keep yourself in fight or flight. This ends up making depression and other negative emotions more painful. In other words, the cold has a globally bad result regardless of whatever weight loss benefits there might be if you just go with it. I would guess that when he looks at the data, even Huberman would agree that my conclusion that shivering isn't better for resilience is correct. Indeed, in his video, he refers to how some of the best research on weight loss comes from anorexic patients who are always fidgeting. These people are thin, but they also live in a constant state of anxiety. That is not adaptive, and there's no reason to adopt a maladaptive disease state as your role model. Anorexia is what I call a negative wedge in my book, The Wedge, when talking about the types of hacks that are possible, but also not very good for a person's psychological or physical health. In fact, it's a great example of why we should be skeptical whenever anyone focuses on an optimal protocol without examining the human experience of what it would be like to follow that new program. We, humans, are holistic beings that need to be understood in a full and complete context, not as objects whose metabolic pathways should be left to run the show. Experience matters. Sensations matter. And experiencing those sensations locks in physiological changes in your body. Finally, it's evidence enough that very few people actually have decided to shiver themselves thin. Instead, everyone I know who does this regularly understands that ice baths are best for building overall resilience. And taking whatever fat-burning side effects come along with simply relaxing in the ice water as an added benefit instead of the primary goal. Now, if you liked this video, please subscribe and share it with someone who you think might benefit from it. If you think I've gotten this whole thing wrong, or you are a constant shiver practitioner who can demonstrate amazing results, please let me know down in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. Until next time.
Do I look thinner?